Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and persons in the public gallery to turn off their mobile phones. Members are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It is not sufficient for members to just put their phones on silent mode, as this will maintain the level of interference with the broadcasting system. Before continuing with our agenda, I would like to take this opportunity to formally welcome Senator Ned O'Sullivan to this committee. This is the first time we have met in public since Senator O'Sullivan's appointment. I want to welcome him and also acknowledge the knowledge and experience that he brings to our committee. As Senator O'Sullivan was appointed in place of Senator Mark Daly, I also think it timely to formally acknowledge Senator Daly's contribution to our work over a number of years. Today we are meeting with representatives from the Reserve Defence Forces Association to discuss issues for the Reserve Defence Forces. You are very welcome here today. The format of the meeting is that we will hear your opening statement before going into a question and answer session with members of the committee. Before we begin, I want to bring to your attention witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee, by the chair, to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against either a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I now call on Mr Richardson to make your opening statement.
Sorry, Chairman. Just before we start, just as Vice President of the committee of the Association, I'd just like to thank yourself and the committee for having us here again, for inviting us. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Mr Chairman, Deputy Senators, ladies and gentlemen, so just in terms of my opening statement, almost 2 years ago to the day, an RDFRA delegation appeared before this committee in public session to report on the current state of the Reserve Defence Force. At the time, we had an effective force of 2,049 members, or exactly 50% of the Reserve's total establishment, and we were facing some serious problems. Recruitment had stagnated. With 2,020 places to fill, we had taken in only 471 new recruits in the preceding 4 years. Retirements due to age and natural wastage were outstripping the Reserve's ability to replace these losses. This was not down to a lack of interest from potential applicants, and in fact in that 4-year period over 10,000 people had applied to join the Reserve, but was rather down to the Defence Force's inability to give sufficient attention to Reserve recruiting. Lengthy delays, frequent cancellations of testing events and generally ad hoc arrangements resulted in large numbers of applicants losing interest during a frustratingly drawn-out process. By the end of each recruiting campaign, only a handful of dedicated applicants remained to be enlisted on each occasion. We were also facing other issues that came under the remit of the military authorities, issues relating to the maintenance of personal protective equipment or the timely processing of payment to members of the Reserve for periods of paid training, all of which were raised during our committee appearance. Meanwhile, we discussed issues that fell under the remit of the Department of Defence, namely their levels of engagement with RDFRA and urgently required initiatives that would require the approval of the Minister with responsibility for defence. In brief, early 2017 was not a good time for the Reserve. 2 years on, we are now very grateful for the opportunity to report on the current status of the Reserve to the committee and inform the committee of the outcomes of our previous appearance. While the effective strength of the Reserve continued to drop in 2017 and early 2018 to an all-time low of 1,653 members in Q1 of last year, by January 2019 it has now risen slightly to 1,840 effective members, the highest strength figure in 2 years. In 2018, the Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Mark Mellett, also revived the Office of the Director with responsibility for the Reserve, previously disbanded in 2013, and so the Reserve now once again has a single senior officer whose responsibility it is to grow and develop the force. Since its inception, the 2 directors who have inhabited the role, Colonel Brian Cleary and the current incumbent, Colonel Gerard Buckley, have initiated training courses that will see the commissioning of new Army Reserve and Naval Service Reserve officers in the near future, new leaders that are vital to the future of the organisation. The Director's Office also streamlined the mechanism by which reservists' pay is processed and is actively seeking to get promotion competitions back on track for all ranks. Make no mistake, there is still more that the military authorities can do to improve the situation for the Reserve. There is an ongoing eyesight standard anomaly that exists in the Naval Service Reserve, whereby an applicant for the Naval Service Reserve can be rejected on eyesight grounds, but that same person can then apply for and successfully join the Permanent Defence Force's Naval Service. The Permanent Force will accept candidates of varying eyesight standards, but the Naval Service Reserve is only permitted to recruit those with 20/20 vision. It must be noted that this committee raised this matter directly with the Minister with responsibility for defence when he appeared before the committee on the 26th of April 2018, and the Minister replied that the eyesight standards were, quote, currently being changed, end quote. That was 10 months ago. However, RDFRA are aware of an initiative by the military authorities to update the Naval Service eyesight standards in line with international maritime standards, but RDFRA sincerely hope that these changes will come into force in the very near future. The Reserve will be recruiting again on the 1st of April 2019, and so time is of the essence. If the eyesight standards are not updated by then, many more Naval Service Reserve applicants will be turned away unnecessarily. Similarly, with another Reserve recruitment competition looming, RDFRA are hopeful that a new Reserve recruitment model that has been developed at the request of the Director with responsibility for the Reserve, a recruitment model that was designed by reservists for reservists and that empowers reservists to manage their own recruitment insofar as is possible, will be implemented in time for the next recruitment competition, which begins in 7 weeks' time. If this is not introduced in time, it will be a lost opportunity to maximise our potential recruit numbers from this competition, and the Reserve will again suffer needlessly as a result. However, to sum up on RDFRA's engagement with the military authorities in recent years, they listened to our 2017 submission to this committee and took serious steps to remedy the issues identified. There is certainly a lot more work to do, but RDFRA wishes to genuinely acknowledge and thank the Chief of Staff, the Assistant Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Peter O'Halloran, and the military authorities for the steps that they have taken to help save the Reserve. Unfortunately, the Department of Defence's attitude towards engagement with RDFRA has been somewhat more aloof. 2 years ago, we reiterated the critical need to amend and update Defence Forces Regulation R5, which governs most aspects of the Reserve's existence, and Defence Forces Regulation S7, which governs our representative association. The Reserve was reorganised in 2013, and new versions of both regulations should have been implemented at that time to reflect the new organisational structures. It is simply beyond belief that new regulations have not been implemented some 6 years later, and despite repeated and consistent efforts on our part to obtain updates from the Department. Indeed, we have offered our assistance in drafting the regulations in order to support the Department. To date, though, the Department of Defence have continuously informed us that updated draft versions of both regulations are currently being developed and worked on. RDFRA, however, has been prevented from seeing these drafts, which effectively prohibits the association from having any input into these documents. And this is an untenable position for the Department to adopt, since we and our members will be the end users of these products. Similarly, there has been no movement whatsoever on any of the Reserve-specific white paper projects announced in that document as far back as 2015. The most serious new issue, however, involving the Department of Defence and the Reserve is the pay discrepancy that the Department of Defence has allowed to form between the Permanent Defence Forces and Reserve Defence Forces rates of pay. In the first instance, it must be highlighted that the majority of a reservist's service is unpaid. Indeed, the best part of training takes place in the evenings and at weekends. However, reservists are entitled to payment when engaged in certain activities, such as full-time training courses. This payment serves to offset the costs associated with a reservist's service in the Defence Forces, including in relation to mileage, time off work and ancillary expenses. However, for the periods of paid training that reservists undertake, there is now a significant discrepancy between permanent and reserve rates of pay. Reserve pay is tied to Permanent Defence Forces pay rates by two ministerial Defence Forces regulations, R5 and S3. These clarify that reservists are entitled to be paid at the lowest point of the Permanent Defence Forces pay scale for their particular rank. However, the vast majority of reservists are currently paid 18% less than the corresponding lowest point on the current Permanent Defence Force pay scale for each rank. This is particularly outraging for reservists, since not only did we suffer a pay reduction at rates variable by rank in 2009, but reservists also received an additional 10% blanket pay reduction in 2013. The reserve pay rate has essentially been plundered twice, and now we are not even on a par with the lowest points of the Permanent Defence Force pay scale. This has significant impacts for our existing members in terms of the costs associated with their continued and loyal service. Furthermore, it also represents an obstacle to attracting new members, particularly young people who may not be in employment and who are not in a position to foot the costs associated with serving in the Reserve. RDFRA notified the Department of this breach of regulations last December, and while we recognise that it is a complex issue, we have not been given an explanation, a plan to settle the arrears, or an expected time to resolution. Our members are deeply frustrated by these delays in taking effective action and rightly question whether a similar attitude would be experienced were the underpayment had been made to our comrades in the Permanent Defence Force. The reserve pay rates need to be realigned with their permanent counterparts immediately. However, RDFRA has serious concerns that such a pay rate realignment could take months or even years for the Department to implement, to say nothing of the payment of arrears. Currently, it is RDFRA's view that the associations and our members' experiences are just one part of a wider malaise affecting defence in Ireland at present, involving the Department of Defence, the military authorities, our colleagues in the Permanent Defence Forces and their two representative associations. What is good for one element of the Defence Forces is necessarily good for all members of the Defence Forces, both permanent and reserve, and so it is RDFRA's view that, to truly improve the defence disposition in Ireland, both for the permanent and reserve forces, we would urge the committee to seek and establish a Commission on the Future of Defence in Ireland, in the spirit of the 2017-18 Commission on the Future of Policing. We would also strongly urge the committee to extend invitations to the Representative Association of Commissioned Officers, RACO, and the Permanent Defence Forces Other Ranks Representative Association, PDFR, and indeed the Chief of Staff and the senior military authorities to appear before this committee and give their own views on defence in Ireland at present. Only by engaging with all stakeholders at this level can the damage done to both the permanent and reserve defence forces be repaired. Such actions are vital to the long-term growth and stability of the defence forces as a whole and also to the continued security of the state. Finally, I wish to conclude with a brief statement on the value of the reserve defence forces. Taking the RDFRA National Executive as an example of what the reserve has to offer, we are all serving reservists, both Army Reserve and Naval Service Reserve, ranging in rank from private to captain, from leading seaman to Naval Service Reserve lieutenant. But in our civilian capacities, we comprise a partner in a major Irish law firm and head of the construction law team for that firm, a trainee solicitor, a legal secretary, a cybersecurity compliance specialist for a multinational telecommunications corporation, a vice president of the Forza trade union, a development manager for a food retail and wholesale company, a telecoms engineer, a PhD history student, and a consultant at Blackrock Clinic who also serves as a professor at Trinity College Dublin. And that is just our national executive. The reserve is full of people like us, and yet we are not currently being utilised to the maximum benefit of the state. Beyond the military authorities, there is generally no interest or willingness in engaging with the concept of utilising the reserve in a meaningful way. Instead, there is a preference to limit the reserve's access to resources, ignore our varied qualifications and skill sets, dismiss our calls for reform, and generally display a hope that we will just fade away and that no one will notice. Apathy is now one of the greatest threats faced by the reserve. But regardless of this, the dedicated remaining reservists are still committed to serving the state. That said, the reserve needs to be meaningfully utilised in order to secure its future. Utilisation provides a meaningful sense of reward. It is a goal to work towards. Perpetually training for training's sake is not enough. With Brexit approaching and a hard border scenario a distinct possibility, the defence landscape in Ireland for the immediate future is somewhat uncertain, and so the Defence Forces needs to be able to rely on all available personnel and assets, should they be required in any contingent scenario. Furthermore, the support that reservists could provide to overseas missions would be of great value to Irish missions abroad. There are already small examples of the true value of reserve utilisation displayed in pockets across the country, most notably in the areas of ICT and cyber, where reservists with specialist civilian IT qualifications have helped to revolutionise the technological and digital assets available to the Defence Forces. But this is just a drop in the ocean of what could be possible with greater reserve utilisation. It is RDFRA's view that, as an achievable first step, a minor amendment to the Defence Amendment Act 2006 would allow reservists to serve outside of the state in roles such as duties of a military representative, secondment to international organisations, conducting or participating in training, carrying out ceremonial duties, participating in exchanges or undertaking visits, undertaking monitoring, observation or advisory duties, participating or undertaking reconnaissance or fact-finding missions, undertaking humanitarian tasks in response to an actual or potential disaster or emergency, participating in sporting events, or inspecting and evaluating stores, equipment and facilities. In essence, it would allow the reserve to take part in a wide range of valuable overseas roles short of deploying on UN missions, which is governed by the Defence Amendment No. 2 Act 1960 and which we are not seeking to have amended at this time. The reserve could also engage in activities governed by the Defence Amendment Act 2006 on the basis of individual reservists presenting themselves as available for service, which would arguably remove the need for employment protection legislation in order to achieve this, as these activities may be of short duration or may require only small numbers of reservists on each occasion. In short, amending the Defence Amendment Act 2006 would provide the vital basis for utilisation that the reserve so desperately needs. Coupled with this, there also needs to be meaningful recognition of the qualifications and skills possessed by reservists, so that should the legislation be updated to permit proper reserve utilisation, the individual reservists' qualifications will be fully acknowledged. My colleague, Dr. Matthew Macaulay, is an excellent example of a highly qualified reservist whose professional background has received a dearth of proportionate acknowledgement from the Defence Forces. Having qualified 19 years ago, he has served as a consultant in international military healthcare systems for 13 years in the US and UK. A Fellow of both the Royal Academy of Medicine in Ireland and the Royal Society of Medicine in the UK, he is also an Associate Fellow of the British Psychological Society. A published expert in his field, he is a consultant at the Blackrock Clinic and a professor at Trinity College Dublin. Despite such experience and competence, Dr. Macaulay was commissioned into the reserve at the rank of Second Lieutenant, the lowest commissioned rank. Should he have joined the Permanent Defence Forces, he would have been commissioned with at least the rank of Captain, or 2 ranks higher than the one he currently holds. In conclusion, the soldiers and sailors of the Reserve Defence Forces are clawing ourselves back from the brink. The senior military authorities are doing what they can to help us, but the extent of what they can do is being limited to a significant degree by factors outside of their control. The reserve is still in danger, and so we require committed political support at all levels to ensure our continued existence and future growth. To summarise, our call to you is to consider our proposal to change the Defence Amendment Act 2006 in the light of all the positive changes that this would bring about to our Defence Forces. Thank you, and I would now like to invite questions from members of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richardson, for your very comprehensive outline of the work of the Reserve Defence Forces and also for the potential for its involvement in much more activities both at home and abroad on behalf of our citizens. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan.
I'll start with just a couple of questions. So thank you very much, first of all, and I suppose to note the couple of positives that there are since the last time that you were here. And the main issue seems to be around engagement with the Department of Defence, if I've got that right in my head. Just one question is about your membership, and I know you outlined your national executive, but I was just wondering about the background of the general type of membership that you have, and when you're talking about the recruitment campaigns coming, who will be your target that you would hope to bring into the reserve forces? The second one is on the time commitment from your members, because it is a reserve force. And, I was struck by the things you were saying that, you need to be meaningfully utilised and the potential that is there. But if your members are reserve, I'm just trying to match up the practicalities of that, how you can be employed more meaningfully, and yes, if you are in other full-time occupations. So they're just my questions for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy O'Sullivan. Mr. Richardson.
Deputy, I suppose to answer your first question on membership and our target, I suppose it's a broad question because our membership demographic is as wide as there are categories of people in the state. We would recruit from students just out of secondary school all the way up to highly qualified specialists. So really, it's hard to answer that question with specifics as to who we're recruiting. Our target, however, for the next recruitment intake will lean a little bit more towards specialists and specialised people. And if I can give one example, the IT experts I referred to in my opening statement, these are people that for the most part will work for international or multinational tech corporations such as Intel, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, this sort of thing. The idea that we would get these individuals to work within the Reserve Defence Forces for the Defence Forces on a predominantly free basis is quite a miracle, really, that they're willing to give their time for free to just be a part of the military family and to engage in that kind of way. So while we will recruit anyone who's interested, and there are roles, non-specialist and specialist roles across the Reserve Defence Forces, the next recruitment competition probably will lean a little bit more towards trying to get these specialists into key areas to help out. In terms of the time commitment, and I take your point that some people will be able to give more or less time, the proposed amendment to the Defence Amendment Act 2006 that we're suggesting would allow maybe a reservist team to go to England or the UK or perhaps to the continent to help out with training activities that would take place there, which may be of a week duration or 2-week duration. Reservists regularly commit to training of that length of time inside of the state anyway. So this kind of dovetails with people's leave from work. For these kind of short deployments, you wouldn't actually require employment protection legislation because it is simple enough for people to actually meet that time commitment from current setups. So we can be used meaningfully for short duration, and that would sit very, very well with the reserve setup.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deputy Jack Chambers.
Thanks, Chair, and I thank the guests for their presentation. Very comprehensive, and also some valuable policy ideas and initiatives which are welcome. There seems to be a mismatch in your language between, you obviously have a very positive engagement with military authorities, they're supportive of the work you do, and of your, of their ongoing commitment to support what you're doing. And then obviously the Department of Defence, you've used language like apathy, aloof, and a general disengagement. You have a lack of response to submissions you're making around, around the various, regulations or whatever. How can that be improved in your view, and who is your direct line of engagement in the Department of Defence? Is it a ministerial matter or is it an official matter, and where is your direct line of engagement? Because I think if we're going to support you as a committee, we need to know and knuckle down as to where is the issue within the Department of Defence. That's just my first question, because there's a clear split in your language between both, and I think if you are going to be supported, it's important we address those issues. Just on a second matter, obviously the last time you were here, you flagged the serious difficulties around numbers and around the mismatch between the white paper target and the actual numbers in the reserves. That's stabilised, but it hasn't got any better. And obviously give some policy ideas there. Like, when do you think we'll reach a point where we'll see proper growth in the numbers, and what can stimulate that? You've obviously mentioned some things there, but I think that's very important if we're going to value it. And also, as part of the white paper and some of the reforms in recent years, obviously some people within the military have discussed it, but have said there's been a destructive policy in parts of Ireland where there was kind of a localised system of recruitment, that's been diminished because of the centralised change that's occurred. Is there anything that can be changed in that basis so that we can see a cross-county improvement in terms of the recruitment of reserves? And are you seeing a geographical disparity in the people who are applying and who are actually becoming reservists as well? But thanks again for your presentation, and as I said, any answers you can bring to that, I appreciate them.
Thanks, Deputy Chambers. Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Chairman, I might answer the section of the Deputy's question on our contact with the Department. I might pass over to my colleague, Mr. Scanlon, for the recruitment answer. Deputy, just on who we engage with the Department, it's predominantly Defence Forces Personnel Policy Branch. That would be our main point of contact within the Department. And the issues we would encounter would be asking questions about documents we know are circulating and looking to get eyes on stuff that would be relevant to us, and being informed that now would be an inappropriate time to pass them on. And we understand that there's work that might need to be done in policy in the background before it's ready to be shown to a representative association. But this would be so consistent and so regular that it is problematic for us that we feel we have our voice isn't being heard and isn't being listened to. And when we ask a question, it is essentially fobbed off, for lack of a better phrase. So that's my answer there. So, James, if you want to take.
Yeah, Deputy, just to take the recruitment side of things there, as you asked about it. I think what we're looking for, and we've been engaging with the J1 Directorate of the Defence Forces, who look after personnel matters, and we've impressed upon them the need for certainty and regularity in the recruitment to the reserve. So we've suggested a framework where recruitment would be open at the same time twice a year, so that everybody knows. If you meet someone and they say, I'm interested in the reserve, you can tell them when to look out for recruitment. And we're trying to time those so that the processing, which involves security clearance, fitness tests, medicals, would all be ready for periods like the academic holiday year. Because to go back to Deputy O'Sullivan's point, one of the demographics we're definitely looking at is people who are leaving secondary school and going into third level, because those people have time on their hands, you know what I mean? And they are the type of people who can give a good commitment to the reserve. They're young, they're fit. We need to lower our age profile, because we're coming out of a period where we had an embargo on recruitment for several years, and then we moved into recruitment, but the model that was there wasn't fit for purpose. And I think that we've high hopes for the next recruitment competition, because a lot of what we saw as the flaws in that model have been tweaked now, and hopefully we can bear fruit from the improvements, the shortening of the time needed for security clearance, and those kind of things, that could bear fruit we're hopeful about the next recruitment competition. But we're looking for consistency and certainty. And you were asking about the demographics of it. It certainly is easier to recruit people in the areas around occupied military barracks, and it is more difficult for the person who has a long journey to a centre like that from a rural area. it takes more commitment from that person to get into the reserve, I would say.
And just final question, just one issue as well, when you look at the Department of Defence documentation, I mean, it's probably demoralising for you to see that you're returning a surplus as a collective back to the Exchequer every year when you're seeing the demise of your, a general demise or stagnation of your numbers. Have you had any engagement on the budgetary matter about trying to keep the general allocation every year, and so that you don't see the reserves returning money to the Exchequer when you have such systemic issues you want dealt with?
I think the main issue there, Deputy, is not that necessarily the budget isn't there for us every year, because to be fair it is. It's more our members aren't being facilitated to utilise the paid training to actually use that budget. I know the department committed to increasing a sort of a control measure ceiling that would make it easier for reservists to access a slightly larger number of paid training days per year. At the moment we have a control measure at 28 days, so when you hit 28 you have to apply for more, and the department must pre-approve these. So the department committed about a year and a half ago to increasing that to 42. So it would still be a control measure, just a little bit more paid training for reservists per year. And as far as we're aware, that still has not yet been implemented. So there is that sort of ceiling that reservists will still hit. We would argue it's a very minor change that would have a drastically positive effect on our members' ability to attend paid training and to be utilised. But it just hasn't been done yet.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Richardson. Senator Ned O'Sullivan.
And I welcome the delegation, and I have to say I find it very interesting. And like I'm on this committee, I didn't know a whole lot about the reserve. I used to be a member of the FCA when I was a young man, and I'd be interested to know what is the correspondence between what was the FCA and the reserve in terms of numbers, for instance. There was nearly every town had an FCA group when I was growing up, so I know it's a much tighter organisation you represent, but I'd like to know the balance there. And also in terms of, I'd like to know the profile of members in general. Now you have obviously some highly qualified people in your ranks. I suspect that the ones that are mentioned here on your presentation are all officer class. I'd like to know, maybe I'm wrong there, but I'd like to know what would be the typical sort of enlisted man or woman's profile. Would he be someone that's employed or unemployed, self-employed, farmers? The gender balance there. And I'm also interested to know what the retirement age is for the reserve. Is it the same as the regular army, or is there a difference? And you asked us to look at the possibility to look into establishing a commission, like the Commission on Policing. Is that your own initiative? Have you talked this out with the regular army? And is there a cross-ranks support on this, or is it just your own initiative? And finally, Cahill, in terms of, I think it's great that people are prepared to put their time, personal time and effort into being part of all reserve defence forces, both land and sea. It's an act of patriotism, in my opinion, and it should be encouraged, and it's very good training for people as well. So I would have hoped that maybe with the centenary commemorations that are ahead of us, that there would be probably opportunities for more involvement by the reserve forces there. I wonder, has that been taken up? That's it, Kyle. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Sullivan. Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Chairman, again, I'm just going to divide the answers between the delegation, if that's okay. I'll answer the Senator's questions, or the bits I'll answer first. Just to explain, Senator, the FCA, as it existed pre-2005, was turned into the RDF in a reorganisation in the year 2005. So it would have had a much larger establishment beforehand, and it was reduced downwards in 2005. Again, in 2013, it went through a further reorganisation to become the organisation it is today, with an establishment of about 4,000 all ranks, of which we currently have 1,800 people in place. So the RDF is the modern FCA, for just to clarify there. The retirement...
Huge shrinkage in numbers, obviously, at all stages.
The RDF has gone through a number of reorganisations over the years, and invariably the reorganisation has always been, what are the current strengths of the FCA or RDF now, and then we will formally reorganise to give it that number as its maximum ceiling. And sadly it drops further, and it's been reorganised downwards to the smallest it's ever been.
I understand, thank you.
The retirement age is comparable to the PDF, to the Permanent Defence Forces. And in terms of the wider support we may have for our views on a commission on the future of defence, I suppose we would argue that the committee may have to address that with the military authorities themselves. I wouldn't want to put words in their mouth. But if
you haven't liaised, sorry, Cahill, you haven't liaised with the permanent forces on this initiative?
That is our view.
As of now?
That is specifically our view at the moment.
Yeah, you're speaking for yourselves, yeah.
Okay. And if I could just pass over to Ms Holohan for the other part.
Just in relation to the general profile of our members, for example, you mentioned about the National Executive being all officers. I'm a sergeant and I'm the Vice President, so
Yeah.
there is exceptions.
Okay.
But it is very varied. We'd have members that would be anything from like solicitors, truck drivers, construction, engineers, people in college. It is quite varied, depending on the area that they're in. I know for myself, for my own unit, there will be an awful lot of variety in the demographics and who's there. I think you mentioned gender as well.
Yeah.
In my own unit, there is 63 people on books at the moment, and 12 of those are females, and the rest are males. So there is.
Would that be consistent with the regular army?
Sorry.
No, sorry, Senator. We actually have a higher proportion of females in the reserve.
Okay.
It's about 12% nationally, as opposed to the permanents 5 to 6%.
Very good. That's good.
So that's.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry.
I just, if I could just on the retirement age there interject, Senator. The retirement age was reduced for enlisted personnel in the last reorganisation in 2005 from 60 to 50, and that was due to a change to R5. And I just want to make the point that at the time there was a lot of work done to R5, or there was another regulation R6 folded into it, and it was all completed by the same Department of Defence within a matter of months. And here we are 6 years later, and we still don't have a new R5. So, you know, in the past, major structural changes to that document have been made in a matter of months. And this time around, we're 6 years later, we haven't even seen a draft.
Yeah, I see that.
Thanks, Mrs. Gunn. Senator Gabrielle McFadden.
Thank you, Cahill. You're very welcome. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate that you give up your time to come into us. I think probably Jack was reading all my scribbled notes, because he literally said practically word for word what I wanted to say. But I really commend you for the work you have done and you know, maintaining what you have and trying to grow it and build it, and it's great. And the Vice Admiral, you know, reviving the officer of the Director, that has, I think, probably helped. I'd love to know why that was disbanded in the first place, or who made that decision in the very first place. I also welcome that the pay process has been streamlined and it's now better and I suppose that happened as a result of the Director being put in place. I acknowledge your gratitude to the Vice Admiral Mark Mellett, and also the Deputy Chief of Staff, or Assistant Chief Brigadier General Peter O'Halloran. I'm a bit parochial because he's based in Athlone, and I'm a bit parochial about Athlone. I'm concerned that there isn't any one person in the Defence Forces personnel policy person. I presume it's a principal officer that you should be dealing with, and that you don't have a name of anybody. And maybe we can do something here from this committee today to get a one person that you guys can deal with. I think everybody made representations after the last time you were in, and things did improve. You ask for political commitment and support here. What can we do to give you that support specifically? And do you think literally that the department are blocking you, and if so, why?
Thank you, Senator McFadden.
And I'm under a little bit of pressure, but if I have to run out, I'm on duty in the
we
chamber, so
understand.
excuse me if I run.
Mr. Richardson.
Deputy, or I suppose why the office of the Director of Reserve was disbanded was simply because of a permanent Defence Forces reorganisation that took place in 2012, the year before our own, which necessarily reduced the amount of senior officers that the Permanent Defence Force was allowed to have, and that office was one of the ones that made the cut. Currently, the revived office is actually a sort of a double hat for a particular individual. So it is actually connected to the Office of Combat Support and ISTAR. So it is actually a kind of a double hat for the individual that's in there. So the current incumbent, Colonel Ger Buckley, is taking on two roles in order to save the reserve as well as do his other job. Okay. In terms of what this committee could do, we fundamentally frankly have always believed that utilisation is the thing that's going to save the reserve. A meaningful form of utilisation, if provided, everything else would flow towards that, towards achieving that goal. So if that is an amendment to the Defence Amendment Act 06 that allows us to participate in these small but equally meaningful overseas tasks, be it training or whatever, that is a very serious step in terms of giving the reserve an actual meaningful role to play within the Defence Forces. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does, absolutely.
Just on that, Senator, if I can say, you know, the Defence Act is a serious impediment to us. And, you know, there have been reservists who, there was a unit that was heavily involved in an IT system and needed to be deployed to Germany for an international exercise. And those people were due to deploy, and the Department of Defence forbade them from deploying because they cited the Defence Act, and it was seen as overseas service to go to Germany for 1 week for an exercise. And it really affected the Defence Forces in that thing. We have a doctor in the Reserve Defence Force. He joined the Defence Forces as a direct entry doctor, and he was recruited because they needed someone to go to Africa at the time. They didn't have enough doctors on staff, so he was brought in, he was given a conversion course, and he was sent to Africa. And when he was out there, it was a pretty serious mission, and when he finished his 6-month deployment, they asked him would he be interested in staying on as a reservist, and he agreed. So they reduced his rank from commandant to lieutenant and put him into the reserve. So the week before, he had been the #1 medical person in charge of 500 or 600 people, and if something went wrong, I mean, you've got tropical diseases, you could have a gunshot wound, whatever, he was the person on point, and everyone trusted him to do that job. Once he had to resign his commission in the Permanent Defence Force. He was then commissioned into the Reserve Defence Force, new number, new everything, and he was now not authorised to do a medical. So if anybody walked in, he was unqualified. Now, he was obviously just as qualified as he was the day before, but he was now unqualified under the regulations to carry out even a medical. And the Defence Forces medical staff are under pressure, and we have people like that, and they're not qualified. They wanted him to go overseas again. He had to resign his reserve commission. He was commissioned back into the Permanent Defence Force as a commandant, sent overseas, brought back, resigned his commission, and now he's a lieutenant again, who isn't allowed to do a medical. And so they take reservists and they put them on the shelf, and they don't really want to use them. Now, the thing about that is, the only way that can be changed is by the people in this building, because and the department can say, well, it's in the Act. There's nothing we can do about it. So we would like to change this so that the Chief of Staff has a pick. He's a bigger pick. If he decides, he can decide not to use the reserve or to use it. But as it stands today, he has no choice. He doesn't have a pick of a reservist if he wants to use it, except by contorting the regulations in order to do it. So we would ask the legislators to look at our proposed amendment.
I'm sorry, I have to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Scott. Deputy Seán Barrett.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just looking at the fact that a recruitment campaign was launched on the 23rd of April 2018, and a total of 1,364 applicants or applications were received, which is an astonishing number, to be honest with you, at this day and age. And it shows the interest that's out there by people who are available. And but a total of 129 of the 1,364 new recruits were inducted to the Army Reserve and the Naval Service Reserve. Like, what happened to the other 1,100? I mean, were they just dismissed? Or, these are people who, I was amazed at the number of applications that were received, to be honest with you. But it's a very healthy sign that the people are interested and are concerned. So I think there's potential that needs to be, looked after. But it is, it doesn't say an awful lot that of 1,364 applicants, that 129 were recruited. Like, what happened to the other, 1,100 and something that weren't recruited? I mean, I'm just very interested in how we can help in trying to encourage that interest that's out there. Are we looking for too much from people, or are we expecting too much for those who are recruited? I don't know, but I'd bow to the four of you to give your views or opinion as to what. I mean, that's what this sort of gathering here this morning is about, to try and see how we can help, how we can improve matters, and how we can encourage more people. But it's just that against the applicants, less than 10% were the people who were actually recruited. So if you have any light you could shed on that, I'd be very interested.
Thanks, Deputy Barrett. Mr. Richardson.
Deputy, happy to respond on that one. Unfortunately, at the moment, reserve recruitment is particularly ad hoc. So what happened to those individuals, the closing date for the competition would have come. Maybe they're first contacted, the majority of them, 2 months later, which would be unusual and would not be great. It would be a bit sloppy. Then they're called forward for a fitness testing date, which would be their first exposure to the Defence Forces recruitment testing procedures. That could be another 6-7 weeks down the line. It might be changed at short notice, and people start to get browned off. Those who make it through that stage have to come back for a medical, which is arranged exclusively during normal working hours. Some of them may have been told the day before, can you come into a barracks at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning? No, I'm sorry, I'm in work. Well, then tough, away you go. So the pool gets smaller and smaller and smaller by a very kind of ad hoc, poorly organised competition, so that the small numbers you see at the very end are the dedicated ones that stuck through the process. Now, myself and James here as well have trialled new recruitment methods in our own units, be it the Defence Forces Training Centre in Curragh or James in the Naval Service around the country. And we found that we've managed to get our recruits from the closing date of the competition to induction, where they can begin training. My unit did it in 9 weeks last year, James did it in 8. So we found that, if you can rapidly organise the testing stages in a formal, correct way, the tempo is kept up, people's interest is maintained, and that is reflected in the numbers that you get into training at the very end. At the same time as my recruits from the 2018 competition were in training last year, the other units around the country were currently training the recruits from the 2017 competition. So it took them nearly 18 months to achieve what myself and James had managed to achieve in a matter of weeks. We then developed this recruitment proposal, which is the one I referred to in my opening statement, that is with the Director of Reserve Forces, to formally structure the RDF recruitment process each year so that it is not ad hoc and sort of turned to whenever there's a kind of a gap in the timeline. We're very hopeful that this gets implemented and is in force for the 1st of April when the new recruitment window opens. Otherwise, we will see the applicants that apply online in April not being sworn in until maybe 2020, which is, unnecessary. And that's where the drop-off happens. People literally get understandably frustrated with this process. There are other time commitments, there are other organisations, voluntary organisations, that will take them in far quicker than the reserve. And it's, I suppose, if the committee could support that, it is to make sure that that formal, structured recruitment process is implemented, because it can be achieved well, and we do get good numbers once that's done.
Deputy, I don't want to take too much credit for the speed at which the Naval Service Reserve people were inducted. The people in the Permanent Defence Forces, particularly Lieutenant Stephen Stack, had put a lot of effort into making sure that it was a very streamlined and quick process. But I would like to point out the one thing that caused our numbers to fall far below Neil's numbers, and that is the eyesight anomaly that we mentioned in the opening statement for the NSR. And it results in us losing about 45% of suitable applicants at the moment. So if Neil, takes in, has 100 people that finish the process, he might get 90 out of it, because 10 of them will go down on medical grounds. We'll lose 45 of those people on medical grounds, and most of them will be to eyesight. And it's just to an eyesight standard that is not fit for purpose. And there is a case there to change it and amend it, but it's just moving very slowly through the bureaucratic process.
Thank you very much, Mr. scan. Dr. McCauley, did you want to make an observation on any of the work of the reserve?
Absolutely. So a few of the points raised already, they're to do with recruitment and retention and terms and conditions of service. But you know, one of the angles that maybe I could develop from what's already been said would be around the specialist side of the RDF. Any comments I might make would be solely in my role as RD FRA National Executive Member and not in any capacity as officially representing the Medical Corps. But some of the points that have already been raised alluded to the fact that the 2015 DF White Paper, Section 7.2, specifically highlighted the utilisation of RDF specialist members where that skill is not retained in the PDF. So it's been 4 years since the department was tasked to develop recruitment and utilisation policies for this particular group within the DF. And despite support from military healthcare authorities and their encouragement for the single force concept across those kind of principles, it really hasn't come to fruition during that time. And I kind of wanted maybe to, if I had through the chair, maybe a moment or two just to elaborate on a few of these key issues. The context really arises, in my view, out of the 2012 DF reorg, where we saw that the establishment of reserve personnel in the medical field reduced from 213 to 35. That's an 84% reduction. And it's currently, the numbers filling those PIDs, if you like, is around 37%. My understanding there's about 3 clinical medical corps officers left. And this has had huge implications, as my colleague has already elaborated. The use of those clinical medical corps officers is restricted in regards to the direct provision of clinical care for DF personnel, partly due to the rank that they hold and where they sit within the organisation, despite often being consultant-level clinicians in their civilian careers. This compares quite shockingly with other jurisdictions, if I'm allowed just to point that out. In the US, for example, 60% of the US Army's medical assets sit in the reserve. And in the UK, 10 of their multidisciplinary comprehensive field hospitals sit in the reserve. Why that might be the case? RD FRA have been notified through representations of our members who sit in the medical field that there's been no overt or strategic recruitment campaign for medical professionals. No opportunities exist for direct clinical provision to military personnel. No opportunities exist to engage in specialist activities outside the state. There's limited career opportunities once you're in the system. There's insufficient numbers of RDF medical personnel to engage in RDF medical exercises. And my colleague has already alluded to the lack of reciprocity between RDF and PDF medical corps officers. Through discussions and through liaison with our RD FRA medical corps members, there's an increasing view that this is unsustainable, despite the support from military healthcare authorities. And also in spite of the fact that it's actually 10 years since the publication of the PA Consulting Report on the Future of DF Medical Services, and 7 years since the DF reorg, and 4 years since the publication of the Defence White Paper. Now, we all agree that the strength, skills mix and use of reserve assets in the medical field is totally within the remit of military authorities, so we're not trying to step into that domain. But from our discussions, there's an increasing view that if proper investment and proper recruitment was put in place, that we might see more fully augmented PDF with RDF assets in the medical field, an expansion of the breadth and depth of DF medical capabilities, ability to deliver a full spectrum military medical operational care pathway, as is seen in other jurisdictions. PDF medical personnel may be augmented in delivering medicals and domestic military clinical activities, and also the opportunity to enhance the DF's overall medical resources. So I think one thing to highlight is that whilst there are these difficulties, the colleagues that have come to RD FRA with these representations are loyal, dutiful and committed members of the DEF. They feel it's an honour to serve in the RDF, and their only objective is to actually to see the RDF medical cadre thrive. But despite the support we're getting from the military medical authorities, the problem still exists. And I think collectively we view the need for change and investment But as has already been alluded to with policies in R5 and so forth, that really political support we feel needs to be applied in order to see some change in light of the years and years of challenges.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCauley. Could I just thank Ms. Holohan, Mr. Scanlon, Mr. Richardson and Dr. McCauley for your presentation here today. You asked about political support. Well, you obviously know that you have it from this committee. This is the second time you've had an opportunity within 2 years to make a presentation to the committee, and I don't think that happened previously. As individual members, we will pursue these issues with the Minister and Deputy Chambers, the main opposition party spokesperson on defence, and Deputy O'Sullivan, Deputy Barrett, and the other members of the committee who are here with us. We will pursue those issues as well. We recognise the importance of them. And we had the Chief of Staff here. For the first time, the Chief of Staff made a presentation to an Oireachtas committee. We've had an ongoing engagement with Minister Crowe, and we will have Minister Crowe here before this committee again in regard to the white paper. We will take the opportunity to raise some of those particular issues. I think I mentioned to you previously, and I mentioned it oftentimes in discussions on defence-related issues, be it estimates or other aspects of the Defence Forces work, of the Department's work, that I'm very conscious of the very important role of the Reserve Defence Forces and its predecessor, the FCA, over the years. I have the privilege of representing over a considerable amount of time 2 border counties. I grew up in a border community. I saw the thuggery, the violence, the loss of lives through the paramilitary activities. And I think it's unsung and it's not recognised enough, the very important role of the Reserve Defence Force during those years. And I have to say, as well as that, it was a very good training ground for young people who may have been vulnerable at that particular time. And I have to say, I know many members of the then FCA, members of Garda Síochána, members of the Permanent Defence Forces, who at times identified young people who may have been vulnerable, who may have not completed their education, who were not in employment, and they ensured that they became members of the then FCA. Many of them went on, progressed to be members of the Permanent Defence Forces, and have served our country with great distinction and with great commitment. I think over the years the Reserve Defence Forces, FCA, have been a very valuable progression route to recruit people into the Permanent Defence Forces. Minister Crowe will tell us here and his department officials that there's a problem in getting people recruited to the Permanent Defence Force. I don't think there's enough being done to use the Reserve Defence Forces as a pathway to a career in the Permanent Defence Forces. I think that would be very important. I think it was farcical one of the years that recruitment was announced in August or something. I said to Minister Crowe and his officials, why do we not target colleges of further education where in many instances there are security courses, there are courses that would appear to have the type of profile of young woman, man, that would be suitable for the Reserve Defence Forces. So I think that there are plenty of avenues to explore in regard to recruitment, but as Deputy Barrett pointed out, it's very frustrating how long the process takes. But I think it's very important. Deputy Chambers referred to the method of recruitment. I think it's very important to have a localised element in it. Because, as I mentioned previously, the local knowledge and the interest of existing members of the Defence Force, of the Reserve Defence Forces, ensure that maybe people who were not aware of the opportunity to join the Reserve, they became aware of it through that local knowledge, through local participation as well. Some time ago, there was, following the 2012 reorganisation of the Defence Forces, there were efforts made to have further reorganisation in regard to the training centres for your organisation. I know at the time the centre in Cavan was proposed to close it. I objected very strongly. We were proposed to be amalgamated into Dundalk, which would be ludicrous. So it would. Thankfully, the centre has remained in Cavan, covering Cavan, Longford, Leitrim and Monaghan, I think is the configuration. But I think it's very important that there is a localised element to the recruitment and also to the training as well. But again, I would emphasise and put on the record on behalf of the committee and my own behalf our appreciation of the work of the Reserve Defence Forces over the years, and that continues. And it's very heartening to hear how representative the Reserve is of society in general. And of course, we would like to see the potential of what contribution those members could make being utilised to the full. And that's clear from your presentation today, that's not happening. But I just want to assure you that we will continue to ensure that the work of the reserve is given recognition within the discussions and the debates that we have here. And we will highlight to the Minister, to the Department, the need to address the issues that you have outlined to us. And again, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you sincerely for your presentation. And we would also like if you will convey to your members our appreciation of the work you do. I think it was Senator Ned O'Sullivan said the centenary celebrations, more of the public became aware of the role of the reserve at that time because they saw individual members participating in the different centenary celebrations around the country. And it's only oftentimes when there are crises or calamities, difficult weather conditions, whatever, that we see that we become more aware of the work of the reserve. So again, we would like if you would convey to your members the appreciation of this committee for your work. And again, I want to thank you for giving us a very comprehensive briefing and dealing very, very well with the issues raised by the members. Before adjourning, I just want to remind members that we have 2 informal meetings before we meet again next Thursday to meet with authorities to discuss the heads of the so-called Brexit bill. We have 2 informal meetings on the 13th and 14th, and the committee secretariat has already notified members of those particular meetings. The meeting now stands adjourned until Thursday, the 14th of February at 4 p.m. Stay for a photograph.